This is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you are watching from. It is always fascinating to see how far these stories can reach. Caddo Lake sits along the border between Louisiana and Texas, a sprawling maze of bayous, cypress trees, and dark water that has existed for thousands of years. In 1927, the lake was even wilder than it is today, less charted, more isolated. The communities that dotted its shores were small, insular, connected by unreliable dirt roads that turned to impassable mud after heavy rains. The nearest town of any size was Marshall, Texas, about 30 miles west, but most folks around the lake rarely went that far. They had everything they needed right there. Or so they told themselves. The water provided fish, the forests provided game, and the distance from civilization provided something else entirely: privacy. On the morning of September 14, 1927, 6 men left the settlement known as Potter's Point on the Louisiana side of the lake. The settlement consisted of maybe 30 families, most of them related by blood or marriage, living in wood frame houses raised on stilts to protect against flooding. Potter's Point had no church, no school, no store. Supplies came in by boat every 2 weeks from Uncertain, a slightly larger community about 8 miles north. The men who lived there made their living from the lake, fishing for catfish and bass, trapping muskrats and nutria, occasionally guiding hunters who came looking for deer or wild hogs. The 6 men were experienced. They knew the lake. They knew its moods, its hidden channels, the sandbars that appeared and disappeared with the water level. Their names were Mercer Guidry, Virgil Tate, Roscoe Phelan, Aubrey Fontenot, Silas Broussard, and Lyle Arsenault. Ages ranged from 28 to 53. All married except for Roscoe, all considered reliable, steady. The kind of men who left at dawn and returned at dusk without fail. They took 3 boats, wooden skiffs with small outboard motors that had been converted from old automobile engines. Each boat carried 2 men, fishing nets, poles, and provisions for the day. According to later testimony from their wives, they planned to work the deeper channels near Goat Island, an uninhabited stretch of land about 4 miles southeast of Potter's Point, where the fishing had been good that season. They did not return that evening. By nightfall on September 14th, the wives began to worry, though not excessively. Engines failed. Boats got stuck in shallows. Men sometimes stayed out after dark to finish pulling nets. But when dawn came on September 15th and the boats were still absent, real concern set in. A search party formed, consisting of 8 men from Potter's Point and 3 from Uncertain who had come to help. They launched just after sunrise, spreading out in a grid pattern to cover the area around Goat Island. What they found was documented in a report filed with the Caddo Parish Sheriff's Office on September 16, 1927. The report, archived in the parish courthouse in Shreveport, is brief and factual. All 3 boats were discovered floating in a cluster near the western shore of Goat Island, roughly 200 yards from land. The boats were undamaged. The engines were off but mechanically sound. Fishing nets were partially deployed, some still in the water, others coiled on the boat floors. Personal items remained: lunch pails containing half-eaten sandwiches, thermoses of coffee, tobacco pouches, 1 pocket watch, 1 Bible. No blood, no signs of struggle. No men. What made the scene particularly unsettling, according to the sworn statement of Dalton Meeks, who led the search party, was the presence of alligators. 7 large specimens, each estimated at 10 to 12 feet in length, were circling the boats when the search party arrived. Alligators were common in the lake, but their behavior struck the searchers as unusual. They did not scatter when the rescue boats approached, which was the normal pattern. Instead, they remained in the area, submerging and resurfacing, as if guarding something or waiting. One member of the search party, a man named Beauregard Wilkes, later told a journalist from the Shreveport Times that the gators seemed focused on a specific spot in the water, a dark patch of deeper current between two cypress stumps. When the rescue boats attempted to approach that area, the alligators became agitated, thrashing and hissing. Wilkes, who had hunted alligators for years, said he had never seen them behave that way. The search party ultimately decided to retreat and return with rifles. When they came back 2 hours later with weapons, the alligators were gone. So was whatever they had been circling. Divers were brought in from Shreveport 3 days later, but the water around Goat Island was dark and silted, visibility near zero. They found nothing. The official investigation, such as it was, lasted less than 2 weeks. The sheriff at the time, a man named Horace Devereaux, ruled the incident an accidental drowning. His conclusion, stated in the final report dated September 28, 1927, was that the men had likely encountered a sudden squall common on the lake during early fall, which had capsized or swamped their boats. They had drowned before they could swim to shore. The alligators, drawn by the commotion, had scattered the bodies, which would likely never be recovered due to the lake's depth and currents. This explanation satisfied no one who actually knew the lake. The weather on September 14th had been clear and calm, confirmed by multiple witnesses. The boat showed no water damage consistent with swamping, and 6 experienced watermen drowning simultaneously in 3 separate boats strained credibility. But the investigation was closed. No further resources were allocated. The families were left with boats, belongings, and no answers. Over the following months, rumors circulated through the communities around Caddo Lake, the kind of whispered speculation that fills the void when official explanations fail to convince. Some said the men had been murdered by bootleggers who operated in the more remote areas of the lake. Prohibition was in full effect in 1927, and the isolated bayous were ideal for distilling and transporting illegal alcohol. Perhaps the fishermen had stumbled onto a still or witnessed a transaction they were not supposed to see. Others suggested the men had simply fled, abandoning their families for reasons known only to them. This theory gained some traction when it was revealed that Virgil Tate had been having financial difficulties, his small farm on the edge of Potter's Point failing due to poor soil and bad luck. And Aubrey Fontenot had recently argued with his wife about her desire to move to Shreveport, closer to her family. But this theory failed to account for why all 6 would leave together, or why they would leave behind valuables and personal items. A darker rumor, mentioned only in the most oblique terms, suggested that the men had been taken by something in the lake itself. Not alligators, but something else, something older. The Caddo people for whom the lake was named had stories about spirits in the water, entities that demanded respect, and sometimes extracted a price from those who took too much or ventured too deep. But these stories were dismissed as superstition by most of the white settlers, even if they occasionally hesitated before entering certain parts of the lake after dark. What none of these theories addressed was a detail that emerged only in private conversations, a detail that several of the widows mentioned to each other, but never to the authorities. In the days before the disappearance, each of the 6 men had seemed preoccupied, distracted. Mercer Guidry's wife, Loretta, later told her sister that Mercer had been having nightmares, waking in the middle of the night with his clothes soaked in sweat, refusing to talk about what he had dreamed. Silas Broussard had snapped at his children over minor infractions, something he rarely did. Roscoe Phelan had stopped going to the weekly card games at the general store in Uncertain, claiming he was tired, though friends said he looked more anxious than exhausted. On September 12th, 2 days before the disappearance, Lyle Arsenault had gone to see Reverend Jonas Pritchett, a traveling preacher who passed through Potter's Point every few months. The conversation between them was never disclosed, bound by the confidentiality of confession, but Pritchett's housekeeper, a woman named Odessa Ricks, later mentioned that when Lyle left the Reverend's temporary quarters in the back of the uncertain general store, his face was ashen. Pritchett himself left the area shortly after the men disappeared, returning to his circuit in Arkansas. He died in 1942 without ever speaking publicly about what Lyle might have confided. The investigation by Sheriff Devereaux had been cursory, but it was not entirely without effort. Deputies interviewed families, searched the shoreline near Goat Island, examined the boats. One deputy, a young man named Calvin Stokes, took detailed notes that were later archived with the case file. These notes, rediscovered during a courthouse renovation in 1963, contain observations that were not included in the official report. Stokes noted that the fishing nets recovered from the boats had been cut, not torn, clean slices through the rope, as if someone had used a knife to free them from something. He also noted that several of the nets contained unusual residue, a thick, dark substance that did not match lake mud or fish oils. Samples were not taken for analysis. Stokes also recorded that the Bible found in one of the boats belonged to Aubrey Fontenot, and it was open to the book of Job, chapter 41, the passage describing Leviathan. A ribbon bookmark had been placed at that specific page. Another detail from Stokes's notes. On the morning the search party found the boats, several members reported hearing sounds coming from the direction of the western shore of Goat Island, sounds described variously as crying, moaning, or the call of an injured animal. When they investigated, they found nothing except trampled vegetation and deep impressions in the mud near the waterline, as if something heavy had been dragged across the ground. These impressions led into the water and disappeared. No photographs were taken. The area was not cordoned off or preserved. Stokes himself left the sheriff's department in early 1928, moving to Monroe to work in a sawmill. In a letter to his brother dated March 1928, preserved in the Monroe Municipal Library, he wrote, "I could not continue working for a man who closes his eyes to what is right in front of him. There are things about that lake business that don't sit square, and I believe the sheriff knows more than he is saying. Or perhaps he was told to know less. Either way, I want no part of it." Life in Potter's Point changed after the disappearance. The community, already small and isolated, turned inward. Families locked their doors at night, something that had previously been unnecessary. Mothers kept their children closer to home. Men who went out fishing traveled in larger groups and stayed within sight of shore. The area around Goat Island became avoided, not officially forbidden, but quietly shunned. Boats that ventured too close reported engine troubles, though mechanics could find nothing wrong with the machinery once they returned to dock. The widows received no compensation, no insurance payouts. In the absence of bodies, the men could not be declared legally dead for 7 years, which meant their assets remained frozen, their property in limbo. Loretta Guidry, with 4 children to feed, moved in with her parents in Uncertain. 2 of the other widows eventually remarried, though not to local men. They left the area entirely. The remaining 3 stayed, scratching out livings through laundry work, sewing, selling eggs, and vegetables. They rarely spoke of their husbands in public, but privately, among themselves, they maintained a vigil of memory, meeting once a month on the anniversary of the disappearance to share a meal and reminisce. In these private gatherings, details emerged that painted a different picture of the weeks leading up to September 14th. All 6 men had been involved in something together, something they had not shared with their families, late-night meetings in Mercer Guidry's shed behind his house, trips to Uncertain that had no clear purpose. On at least 2 occasions in August, the men had been seen loading supplies onto their boats well after dark, heading out onto the lake with their running lights extinguished, returning hours later with nothing visible to show for the effort. When the widows compared notes, a pattern emerged. Each husband had come into a small amount of extra money in the weeks before the disappearance. Not much, perhaps $20 or $30, but significant for families living on the edge of subsistence. When asked about the money, the men had been evasive, claiming it was from selling fish to a buyer in Marshall or from doing odd jobs. But the timing was consistent, and the amounts were similar. One of the widows, Marguerite Fontenot, kept a detailed household account book, as was common practice among women managing scarce resources. Her records showed that Aubrey had given her $25 on August 18th, another $30 on September 2nd, and had promised another payment after the last job, which was scheduled for mid-September. She had assumed he meant a fishing contract, but in retrospect, the phrasing struck her as odd. The last job implied a finite series of tasks, not the ongoing work of commercial fishing. These private suspicions were never formalized into an official complaint or request to reopen the investigation. The women had no evidence, only intuition and fragments of overheard conversations. And in 1927, in rural Louisiana, the testimony of widows carried little weight with law enforcement, particularly when it contradicted a closed case. The area around Goat Island remained quiet for decades. Fishermen continued to work the lake, though most gave that particular stretch a wide berth. The settlement at Potter's Point gradually depopulated, younger generations moving to cities for work, older residents passing away. By 1950, only a handful of families remained, and by 1960, the settlement was effectively abandoned, the houses reclaimed by water and vegetation during seasonal flooding. In 1967, a graduate student from Louisiana State University named Wallace Kern received permission to conduct research on the economic history of Caddo Lake communities. His focus was on how Prohibition-era policies had affected rural fishing economies, a topic that aligned with renewed academic interest in the social impacts of the Volstead Act. Kern spent 3 months living in Uncertain, interviewing elderly residents, reviewing courthouse records, and exploring abandoned settlements. It was during a visit to Potter's Point, by then almost entirely overgrown, that Kern discovered something that would redirect his research entirely. Inside what remained of Mercer Guidry's old house, partially collapsed but still standing, Kern found a metal toolbox wedged behind a false panel in the back of a closet. The toolbox contained several items: a ledger with dates and dollar amounts, a hand-drawn map of Goat Island with specific locations marked in red ink, and a letter dated September 10, 1927. The letter was unsigned, written in hurried script on cheap paper. It read, "The next delivery is Thursday dawn, same location as before. Bring the full count this time, no more excuses. If this goes smooth, you're done. If not, well, you know what happens to men who can't keep their word." Kern recognized the potential significance immediately. He photographed the documents and brought them to his advisor at LSU, Professor Harold Messner, who specialized in organized crime history. Messner, intrigued, contacted colleagues at Tulane and the University of Texas, and together they began cross-referencing the ledger entries with known bootlegging operations in the region during the late 1920s. What emerged was a picture of a small-scale but sophisticated smuggling operation. The dates in the ledger corresponded with documented shipments of illegal alcohol from distilleries in East Texas, transported across the border into Louisiana via the maze of waterways that made up Caddo Lake. The dollar amounts matched the going rate for ferry work. Transporting crates from drop points on the Texas side to pickup locations on the Louisiana side, where trucks could access them via back roads. Goat Island, isolated and densely forested, was an ideal transfer point. The western shore, where the boats were found, had deep water close to land, suitable for larger vessels. The eastern shore was accessible by a dirt road that connected to a network of logging trails, since grown over but clearly visible on 1920s-era maps. The men from Potter's Point, it appeared, had been recruited to provide local knowledge and transportation. They knew the lake, knew the channels could navigate in darkness. And they needed the money. the arrangement had likely seemed low risk, a few hours of work for substantial pay, helping move crates that officially did not exist. But something had gone wrong on September 14th. Professor Messner and his colleagues published their preliminary findings in 1968 in a paper titled Prohibition Enforcement and Rural Complicity, a case study from Caddo Lake, 1927. The paper used the Guidry documents and other evidence to argue that the 6 missing fishermen had been caught in a violent confrontation between rival bootlegging factions, or possibly between smugglers and federal agents conducting a sting operation. The paper cited additional circumstantial evidence. Treasury Department records from 1927, declassified in the early 1960s, showed that a Bureau of Prohibition task force had been active in the Caddo Lake area during the summer and fall of that year. Several arrests were made in August and September, including the seizure of a large, still near Karnak, Texas, just north of the lake. One agent's report, dated September 20, 1927, mentioned rumors of a confrontation involving local contractors, but provided no details. Messner's team also tracked down surviving family members of the missing men. Most were elderly by then, living scattered across Louisiana and Texas. Some refused to speak to the researchers. Others shared stories that had been passed down, fragments of family lore. One granddaughter of Roscoe Phelan mentioned that her grandmother had once told her that Roscoe had gotten mixed up with bad people and had paid the price for greed. A nephew of Silas Broussard provided a more concrete detail. He possessed a photograph taken in the summer of 1927 showing several men standing beside a large flatbed truck loaded with crates. The photograph was grainy, but Silas could be clearly identified, along with 2 other men from Potter's Point. The remaining figures in the photo were unfamiliar. One man, standing slightly apart from the others, wore a suit and hat that marked him as someone from outside the rural community, someone with money and authority. The nephew had inherited the photograph from his father, who had received it from Silas's widow before she died in 1961. On the back of the photograph, written in faded ink, was a single word, Tulos. This name became the focus of the final phase of Messner's research. Tulos was a surname associated with organized crime in Shreveport during the Prohibition era. The Tulos family controlled speakeasies, gambling operations, and, according to FBI files from the period, a significant portion of the illegal alcohol trade in northwestern Louisiana. The family patriarch, Augustus Tulos, had connections to larger syndicates in New Orleans and Memphis. He was known for enforcing agreements strictly and dealing harshly with those who betrayed him or failed to deliver. Augustus Tulos was never charged with any crime related to bootlegging, despite multiple federal investigations. He was well connected politically, contributing to the campaigns of sheriffs, judges, and state legislators. When Prohibition ended in 1933, he transitioned seamlessly into legitimate businesses, real estate, timber, eventually banking. He died in 1952, a respected member of the Shreveport Chamber of Commerce, but in 1927, according to several confidential informant reports preserved in FBI archives, Augustus Tulos was actively expanding his operations into rural areas, recruiting locals to assist with transportation and distribution. The pattern was consistent: offer money to men who were struggling financially, involve them in what seemed like simple, low-risk work, then tighten the grip once they were compromised. If the 6 men from Potter's Point had indeed been working for Tulos, their disappearance made a different kind of sense. Perhaps they had attempted to back out, to walk away from an arrangement that had become more dangerous than anticipated. Perhaps they had witnessed something they were not supposed to see, or one of them had talked to the wrong person. Or perhaps they had simply been in the wrong place when a federal raid went wrong, and eliminating them was easier than risking their testimony. The presence of the Alligators took on a different meaning in this context. Caddo Lake was well known for its alligator population, and several unsolved disappearances in the 1920s and 1930s were attributed to alligator attacks, though few of these attributions were thoroughly investigated. It would have been a convenient way to dispose of bodies in a region where law enforcement resources were limited and forensic techniques were primitive. Messner's final report, completed in 1969, was more cautious than his earlier publication. He acknowledged the limitations of the evidence and the difficulty of reconstructing events 4 decades after the fact. But he concluded that the most plausible explanation for the disappearance of the 6 fishermen was that they had been murdered as part of a criminal operation, and their bodies disposed of in a manner designed to prevent identification and frustrate investigation. The report received limited attention outside academic circles. A brief article appeared in the Shreveport Journal, but it was buried on an interior page. The families of the missing men were not interviewed for this article. The Tolos family, by then run by Augustus's son, declined to comment. Wallace Kern completed his doctorate in 1970, but he never returned to the subject of Caddo Lake. In a letter to Professor Messner, dated December 1969, he wrote, "I have spent enough time looking into darkness. There are too many questions that cannot be answered, and too many answers that no one wants to hear. I am moving on to other topics, other places." Messner himself expressed frustration in his private correspondence. In a note to a colleague in 1971, he wrote, "The problem with researching crimes that occurred in isolated communities is that the isolation protects not just the victims, but also the perpetrators. Everyone knew something was wrong in 1927, but no one with authority cared enough to pursue it. And now, decades later, we can reconstruct the outline of what happened, but the specific details, the names, the exact mechanism of the crime, all of that is gone. We are left with shadows." One detail from Messner's research remained unpublished, deemed too speculative to include in academic work. During his interviews with surviving family members, he encountered a woman named Inez Broussard, a daughter-in-law of Silas Broussard, who had married into the family in the late 1930s. Inez was elderly, in her 70s, living in a nursing home in Minden, Louisiana. Her memory was fragmented, but she retained vivid recollections of stories told by her husband's mother, who had been one of the widows. According to Inez, her mother-in-law had confessed something in her final days. On the night before the men disappeared, Silas had come home late, agitated. He had told his wife that something bad was going to happen, but he felt he had no choice but to see it through. He had mentioned owing money, being in debt, but not to a bank. When his wife pressed him, he had said only that men like that don't forget, and they don't forgive. And Inez also mentioned that her mother-in-law had received a visit years after the disappearance, probably around 1935 or 1936. A man in a dark suit driving an expensive car had come to the door. He had asked to speak with her privately, and they had talked for perhaps 20 minutes on the front porch. After he left, she had gone inside, locked the door, and refused to discuss what had been said. But from that day forward, she had stopped attending the monthly gatherings with the other widows. She had stopped talking about the disappearance entirely, and when her children asked questions, she would simply say that some things were better left buried. Messner noted this story in his research journal, but did not pursue it further. The woman who had received the visit was long dead. The man in the suit, if he had ever existed, was beyond identification. But the pattern it suggested, of intimidation continuing years after the crime, added a darker dimension to the case. Sheriff Devereaux, who had closed the investigation so quickly in 1927, retired in 1935 and moved to Houston. He lived comfortably until his death in 1949, well above the means of a rural sheriff's salary. His financial records, examined briefly by Messner's team, showed several large deposits in the early 1930s, sourced from consulting fees paid by a company that appeared to be a shell corporation with ties to Shreveport real estate interests. This was suggestive but not conclusive. Devereaux never faced any legal consequences. Deputy Calvin Stokes, the young officer who had taken detailed notes, left law enforcement entirely after his brief tenure. He worked in sawmills, then as a railroad freight clerk, dying in 1958 from complications of emphysema. In his final years, according to his daughter, he occasionally mentioned the lake incident, always with a tone of regret. He believed the men had been killed, and he believed the killers had been protected, but he had been too young, too powerless to do anything about it. The area around Goat Island remained largely undisturbed for decades. In the 1970s, environmental conservation efforts led to the establishment of Caddo Lake State Park on the Texas side, and increased recreational use of the lake. Tourists came for fishing, bird watching, and scenic boat tours through the cypress forests. The history of Potter's Point was occasionally mentioned in local tourism materials, usually framed as a once thriving fishing community, now abandoned due to economic changes. The 1927 disappearances were sometimes referenced as well, but in sanitized form. 6 local fishermen went missing under mysterious circumstances, their boats found empty near Goat Island. The cause was never determined. No mention of bootlegging, no mention of organized crime, no mention of the possibility that law enforcement had been complicit in covering up murders. In 1989, a journalist named Patricia Vance, working for the Dallas Morning News, attempted to write a feature story on unsolved mysteries of East Texas. She contacted Wallace Kern, by then a retired professor living in Baton Rouge, asking for access to his research materials. Kern agreed to meet with her, but warned that much of what he had discovered was circumstantial. During their conversation, which Vance recorded and later transcribed, Kern expressed continued frustration with the case. "The problem," he said, "is that everyone involved had a reason to lie. The families were afraid the authorities were either complicit or incompetent, and the criminals certainly weren't going to confess. So we're left with fragments, hints, patterns that suggest a crime, but never quite prove it. And the longer I looked at it, the more I realized that maybe that was the point. Maybe the disappearance was designed from the start to be unsolvable, to look like an accident, to generate just enough uncertainty that no serious investigation would be launched. And it worked. Those men vanished, and the world moved on." Vance's article was never published. Her editor decided the story was too dated, too regional, and lacked a compelling resolution. The recorded interview remained in Vance's personal archives, rediscovered after her death in 2018, and donated to the Texas State Historical Association. One final document came to light in the late 1990s, during the demolition of an old warehouse in Shreveport that had once been owned by Augustus Tolos's business empire. Workers found a locked safe in a basement storage room. The safe was opened by the salvage company, revealing various business records from the 1920s and 1930s, most of them mundane ledgers and contracts. But among these papers was a small notebook, pocket-sized, with entries written in a terse-coded shorthand. The notebook was eventually acquired by a private collector of Prohibition-era memorabilia, who recognized that the entries appeared to document illegal transactions. With the help of a historian specializing in organized crime, the collector attempted to decode the entries. Many remained opaque, but several could be tentatively interpreted. One entry, dated September 15, 1927, read, "CP matter resolved. No further attention required. HL confirms disposal complete." CP could have stood for many things, but given the date and the context, Caddo Point, or Cypress Point, seemed plausible, perhaps a code name for the Potter's Point operation. HL was never identified with certainty, though several associates of Augustus Tolos had those initials. Disposal was a term that appeared multiple times in the notebook, usually in contexts that suggested the elimination of problems, whether those problems were rival operations, uncooperative business partners or witnesses. The notebook's authenticity was never definitively established, and it remains in private hands, unavailable for academic study. Its existence was mentioned in a 2003 book on Prohibition-era crime in the South, but the author had not been able to examine the document directly and relied on second-hand descriptions. So the case remains, as it has for nearly a century, suggestive but unresolved, a constellation of facts and inferences that point toward a crime but never quite illuminate it fully. The 6 men who left Potter's Point on the morning of September 14, 1927, never came home. Their boats were found, their belongings recovered, but they themselves became part of the dark water, part of the silence that has always surrounded Caddo Lake. For the families they left behind, the not knowing was perhaps the worst part. Grief can be processed when there is closure, a body to bury, a gravestone to visit. But absence without explanation is a wound that cannot heal, a question that echoes across generations. The children who lost fathers that day grew up with shadows in their family histories, stories that began with confidence and ended with uncertainty. Some of them eventually left Louisiana entirely, moving to California, Michigan, anywhere distant enough that the lake and its memories could not follow. But some stayed. They stayed in Uncertain, in Marshall, in the small towns along the border between Louisiana and Texas. They grew old themselves, became grandparents, then great-grandparents, and they passed down the story of the 6 missing men, though the details changed with each telling, the edges softening or sharpening, depending on who was speaking. By the time the 21st century arrived, the disappearance had become folklore, one more ghost story associated with Caddo Lake, a place that had always attracted such stories due to its atmospheric combination of dark water, ancient trees, and geographic isolation. Tour guides sometimes mentioned the incident, usually getting the facts wrong, conflating it with other disappearances, adding supernatural elements that were never part of the original accounts. The descendants of the missing men, those who could be located, had mixed feelings about this folkloric transformation. Some resented it, the trivialization of real loss into entertainment for tourists. Others accepted it as inevitable, the way history becomes myth when enough time passes and enough witnesses die. A few actively contributed to the myth-making, seeing it as a way to keep memory alive, however distorted. In 2016, a documentary filmmaker named Jason Pruitt reached out to several of these descendants, proposing a film that would attempt to separate fact from legend and present the most credible explanation for what happened in 1927. Most of the family members declined to participate. One woman, a great-granddaughter of Mercer Guidry, agreed to an initial interview but then withdrew, saying she did not want to stir up old pain. Pruitt proceeded without their cooperation, conducting research in the same archives that Wallace Kern and Harold Messner had explored decades earlier. He obtained copies of the documents, photographed the remains of Potter's Point, and interviewed local historians. His documentary, titled The Cypress Lake Six, was completed in 2017 but received limited distribution, playing primarily at regional film festivals. The documentary did not claim to solve the mystery. Instead, it presented the various theories, the evidence for each, and the reasons why certainty remained elusive. It ended with footage of Goat Island, the camera slowly panning across dark water and cypress trees, while a voiceover noted that some questions have no answers, that sometimes all we are left with is the evidence of absence, the boats without the men, the stories without conclusions. What happened to Mercer Guidry, Virgil Tate, Roscoe Phelan, Aubrey Fontenot, Silas Broussard, and Lyle Arsenault on September 14, 1927. The most probable explanation, supported by the fragmentary evidence that survives, is that they were murdered, their bodies disposed of in the lake, victims of a criminal enterprise that valued secrecy above human life. The alligators found near the boats may have been drawn by blood, Or perhaps they were simply alligators, doing what alligators do, their presence transformed by fear and rumor into something more sinister. But probability is not certainty. There remain gaps in the narrative, moments where the evidence thins to conjecture. We can construct a plausible sequence of events. The men, desperate for money, agreed to work for bootleggers. They transport illegal cargo across the lake, probably multiple times over several weeks. On September 14th, something goes wrong. Perhaps they're caught by federal agents, and the bootleggers eliminate them to prevent them from testifying. Perhaps they demand more money or threaten to quit, and are killed to maintain control. Perhaps there is a dispute over payment, or one of them becomes a liability in some other way. They are killed, possibly at the western shore of Goat Island, possibly while still on their boats. The bodies are weighted and sunk, or given to the alligators, or both. The boats are set adrift to be found, creating the appearance of an accident. Witnesses, if any, are intimidated into silence. The local sheriff, either bought or simply unwilling to challenge powerful interests, closes the investigation quickly. This is the story that can be told with the evidence available. It fits the facts as we know them. It accounts for the money, the secretive behavior, the cut fishing nets, the rapid closure of the investigation, the intimidation of witnesses, the coded entries in the Tullos notebook. But it remains in the end an inference. We cannot prove it. We cannot name the specific individuals who pulled the triggers or weighted the bodies or bribed the sheriff. We cannot point to a burial site or a confession. All we can do is look at the pattern and say, this is what it suggests. This is what probably happened. And perhaps that is sufficient. Perhaps the value of historical inquiry is not always in achieving perfect certainty, but in recovering what can be recovered, in giving voice to those who were silenced, in insisting that their lives mattered, even if their deaths remain obscure. The 6 men who disappeared from Caddo Lake in 1927 were not famous. They were not wealthy or powerful. They left behind little in the way of written records or lasting achievements, but they existed. They had families, hopes, routines, flaws, moments of joy and sorrow. They woke on the morning of September 14th and made a decision to go out onto the lake, and that decision led to their deaths. They deserve to be remembered not as symbols or ghost stories, but as real people who lived in a specific time and place, who were caught up in circumstances that overwhelmed them. Their story is a reminder of how easily people can disappear, especially people without resources or power, especially in times and places where authority is corrupt or indifferent. It is a reminder that justice is often contingent, that the truth can be obscured by those who have the means and motivation to obscure it, that some crimes are never solved, not because they are insoluble, but because no one with sufficient power cared enough to solve them. The water of Caddo Lake is still dark, still difficult to navigate. The cypress trees still stand, draped with Spanish moss, casting shadows that move with the wind. Goat Island is still there, still isolated, visited occasionally by fishermen or bird watchers who likely do not know what happened near its western shore nearly a century ago. The houses at Potter's Point are gone, reclaimed by the lake during floods, their foundations eroded, their timbers rotted. The people who lived there, who worked the lake, who knew the missing men, are all dead now. But the story persists, in archived documents, in family memories, in academic papers that few people read, in a documentary that few people saw. It persists because, even in the absence of complete answers, there is value in asking the questions, in acknowledging that something happened, that lives were lost, that wrongs were done. On the morning of September 14, 1927, 6 men left their homes and entered the water. They did not return. That much is certain. Everything else is darkness, inference, the echo of footsteps that led to the edge and then stopped. And in that darkness, in that silence, we might hear, if we listen carefully, the faint sound of voices calling across the years, asking to be remembered, asking for their story to be told, even if it cannot be told completely, even if the ending remains unwritten. Some mysteries are never solved, some questions are never answered, but they can still be asked. And in the asking, in the refusal to forget, there is a kind of justice, imperfect but real. The lake remains, the trees remain, and somewhere in the archives, in the memories of scattered descendants, in the dark water itself, the truth remains, waiting for someone to find it, or for time to finally erase it completely.